Hi class, tonight we're going to be talking about graphic design because at the end of this project I am going to have you lay out all of these overlays we're doing and focus on some of these principles of graphic design in that layout. So in landscape architecture and a lot of the associated disciplines, we really are talking about informational design. And so these can be tricky to lay out because there's a lot of information we're trying to convey at many different levels. So when we turn to some of the good principles of graphic design, that's going to help our information become more understandable. So envisioning information, our world is complex, dynamic, multi-dimensional, and as we've talked about before, paper is this static and flat two-dimensional object. So we have a challenge in how to represent this rich visual world on paper. So some of these strategies are going to help convey that information. So you can see these are examples of posters and informational displays. On the left, you have a couple posters. Coastal Cleanup Day, there's some basic information. Below is, a national park, ad poster about preserving the national park. Versus in the middle, the large frame is what we would call an informational display. And even the fact that this is all written in a foreign language, we can still kind of get the gist of what information is trying to be conveyed here. So we can see this is about weather patterns, about cold fronts and warm fronts, maybe how they move through this region, about these kind of coastal mountains and how they affect weather patterns. So there's a lot of information we can pick up just in the layout of the graphics without even understanding the words. And so that's the type of kind of informational displays we tend to use in design. So information displays unify complex ideas, express the image, essential character, purpose, and underlying essence of a project. They start to bring together the image, words, numbers, and art into one canvas. And they really start to pull from understanding of art and graphic design and communication skills. Depending on how deeply you get into computer programming, you can get into desktop publishing, and we bring these to planning commissions and speak to them. So then you've got a strength in people who are strong writers to be able to convey in a written format. So you're really using all these different types of presentation skills to give your project the best chance at being built. And really it comes down to graphic skill, oral speaking skills, and written skills. And we really pull from all of those in this discipline. So graphic design components, the things that are typically considered if you were a graphic designer, we would look at the overall layout. We would understand how grids work to create that layout, what type of fonts we're using or typography, what types of colors we might choose, and then I'll provide some examples for you. So for layout, our layout is really a map for the viewer, and a good layout is going to guide the viewer through the information. Using different skills that we'll talk about, you can create a sense of hierarchy or order about which elements the viewer should read first, and then bigger, like example would be bigger text is more bold and more attention getting, so that's usually a high or an elevated hierarchy, versus very small text is more detail oriented. So National Geographic, by the way, does some of the best informational displays probably in the world. This is an example of a National Geographic map, and you can see that hierarchy really is working well here. You have Either your eye enters this drawing either in the upper left-hand corner, because we are in an English-speaking world, we tend to read from left to right, and that upper left-hand corner is premium real estate. So you've got kind of this big bold print that says this is about the northeastern USA, or your eye might be more visually inclined and it might start to explore the big map at the center of the page first and then roll up to that northeastern USA. You can see the different text sizes. So in that first paragraph, even the descriptive text is pretty big. But as you get down into the smaller support pictures, you can see the size of the text is also getting smaller. So that is that information hierarchy. That's related to size. I would say a little bit with texture with that map is kind of attention getting. There's certainly more color on that map. There's a lot of things drawing you into that map to look at that first, and also that upper left-hand corner of text. And so the idea is, if, say you were at a planning meeting and you had your project printed on a board, some people might walk up and they just might look at the plan really quickly and they might read the title and then that's all they want to know. But some people might be really involved. Maybe it's a park project and their children play softball at this park and they want to know all the detail. Then they might stand in front of an informational graphic like this and read every little element of text on there to really understand the complete project. And important to note that this is really designed to be self-supporting in this case. So it doesn't require the person who created it to be there to walk you through it. We don't always design that way. Sometimes we know that we'll be presenting that, so we use much less text, but a good example nonetheless. So layout strategies are some things that to consider is size, value, weight, the use of white space, position, texture, and color. So size, we talked about that map being very large. Value, we've got this kind of deeper, darker green there. The weight of it, that's kind of the amount of attention-getting elements that it has. There's certainly a texture. It's got this big visual weight. It's got some use of white space to surround that so it doesn't feel very crowded. Even though it starts to kind of purposely push off the page, there is some areas that are restful to the eye around it. We've got this upper left position, which we discussed. We've got this texture in the map itself. And, we have a pretty restrained color palette in here. So pretty kind of greens and browns. So not getting too bold. There's a little bit of yellow in there, but it's a pretty not contrasting type of color arrangement, which keeps it a little bit calmer. So here's an example of a color contrast. So we will get into color theory a little bit more in this class, but certainly yellow and blue are contrasting colors. And when we place them next to one another, they become very attention-getting. So white space, it's not empty space. Don't feel the need to fill every square inch on your layout. White space gives the brain and people's eyes a chance to rest. And so it's critical to help direct the eye through a layout. And it's also critical to, I think, keep people from getting overwhelmed looking at a layout. Again, on this example, you notice that larger text in the upper left-hand corner that clearly draws you in, and then to me, I filter then through this map with the smaller callouts on it, and then I kind of read the bottom trends and terror at the bottom. That's the way my eye flows through that arrangement. Grids are important to layout. So grids are really kind of a way to align all the components of a design. So this maintains flexibility in the design, but also creates a sense of order. And just, a kind of a advanced design is if you use narrow margins in your layout, that creates a little bit of tension in your layout, versus if you leave a bit wider margin, it provides a calmer feeling to your layout. So you can see how that grid is being populated. So even though that layout's pretty dynamic, it's still kind of constrained within that grid, which is what's providing a little bit of a sense of an order. Grids can be really complex. So here's a very complex informational display, and this designer has actually taken and pulled the invisible grids out of that overlay to show you that these can be quite complex things. But even with the busyness of that poster or that informational display, you can see that it has this orderly appearance. There is alignments throughout it that keep it not so overwhelming to read. So that is what we call reverse engineering, is really trying to understand like the grids and the things on a set of informational displays. Again, this is a National Geographic. They are really great at conveying very complex ideas to a wide variety of audiences with different educational levels very clearly. So here's that layout, and then you can start to see the grid that is part of that layout. So work on, as you lay out these in this project, you can also check yourself by reverse engineering your own design. So you can start adding those grid lines and see if that's working for you. All right, so there's another, this would be a more traditional landscape architecture plan, but you can still see there's a nice kind of grid pattern going on there. All right, so proportions, we do have this classical mathematical proportion, the Fibonacci series, and basically you have the idea that you've got this perfect square, and you take the diagonal across the square and swing it down and use that now longer edge to create a rectangle. And that rectangle is in ideal proportion to that square. So for Advanced Design 101, you can keep in mind this kind of classical proportionality of shapes. And we will get into that more in like Design 2. So grid layouts, they can be simple to complex. Text-dominated layouts require simpler grids, and as images are added, then the grids can hold more complexity without being overwhelming. Typography. So fonts have kind of their own personality to them. So when you're choosing a font, think about, does it mean something to you? Is there an association with it? If you're doing an arts and crafts type of landscape, maybe you want to choose a font that's reflective of the arts and crafts style. There's also fonts that we have associated with very specific things. So be careful of fonts, because they can really set a tone for your project and not always be in keeping with how you want to convey it. And if I remember, I will post a really funny video on Comic Sans, which graphic designers hate. But rule 1 is you want optimum legibility. So choosing classical time-tested faces with a proven track record is always a safe bet. And here's an example of some of those. Be careful not to use too many different typefaces at one time. So they can really start to compete. They can really start to detract from the ease of reading a layout, right? Because you're focused so much on trying to transition between these different fonts. So pick one, maybe two fonts for your layouts. And then you can see some are so similar, like at the bottom, the Garamond and Frutiger Bold they're so similar you can hardly tell the difference. So that doesn't make any sense to switch fonts between those two. Too similar doesn't point out anything important. So there's an example of three different fonts that are so similar, it just looks kind of strange. Now we are guilty of this a lot. We tend to do text in full capitals, but this really impairs reading. So use of upper and lower cases for these kind of informational displays is really recommended. We tend to use all capitals in our construction documents phase. And one of the reasons that we do is a lot of times contractors will reduce our plans, maybe by half size. Maybe they just want to carry around an 11 by 17 set instead of a big plan set. And it helps retain the legibility if we're using all caps when they reduce it to this tiny little font size. So that's one of the reasons that all capitals are used in design, but it doesn't work so well on these informational displays. And then think about that hierarchy or the sizes of text. So for those big headlines like we saw in the upper left-hand corner, you might use a 72 or a 48 or a 60 point, depending on how big your paper is. For those medium kind of attention gettings, we might be in a 20 to 36 point type of text font. And then our regular font that's a small detail is usually 12 to 16. I could say you could go down to 11. Once you get below 11, it becomes really difficult for a lot of people to read. So I wouldn't go smaller than 11 point font. And all of this is dependent on how much and what type of information that you need to include in your informational display. So here's what I was talking about with the typographic personality. You can see these very different types of fonts have a very different, they give a different feel to the name of this museum. I especially think the one, that's the fifth one down, that looks like, you know, I just associate that with like horror movies. So, you know, it seems like, oh, that would be like a scary museum. You know, the one below that is very kind of almost like Western to me. So that's what we mean, but that some fonts have a personality. So make sure that if your font is one with a personality, it's in keeping with what you're trying to convey. Serifs are the small lines at the end of each letter, and they typically accompany fonts rooted in classical styles. So Times New Roman. The New York Times uses a serif font. It's a very classical, time-tested paper, and they purposely choose that for their paper style. Sans-serifs, or without serifs, are the ones that don't have these little tiny edges at the end of each letter. These tend to be more contemporary, and they also can be a bit easier to read. And Arial, which we all know and love, is one that is considered a sans-serif font. Color is important. So light colors tend to work better than dark colors for backgrounds. Warm colors, especially for landscape, tend to make that landscape, I don't know, come alive a little bit better. It's vivid, dull colors. That's a personality thing. I like color, so I tend to use bolder colors. I've also scared clients away with bold colors, so I've learned to get more into the pastels and try to get a sense of my client a little bit more. Choose your color for the largest area first, and it can simply be black or white. You know, you don't have to have a background color, but if you choose to have a background color, choose that kind of biggest area first, and then choose the complementary color or colors for that. So pick the shades first. For instance, use all light colors or all dark colors. and then pick the hues, which is the actual tint of the color. So we also want to limit the number of color choices. So 2 or 3 colors is usually about all you need. 5 starts to get really carnival-like and distracting. Generally, we want 1 dominant color and either 1 or 2 colors that are accent colors to support the whole scheme. Use vivid colors sparingly. They can be annoying if used too much. They're generally used as an accent color, and then mediate that with a neutral color or an achromatic shade, something that's close to it. You know, like if you have green, put blue with it so that it tones it down a little bit. And don't use vivid colors as a background color. And then when in doubt, use achromatic colors. So that's the black, white, and gray. They're simple and elegant. You can always use black, white, gray and add 1 color in if you're worried about going overboard with color. Familiar colors. I really like looking to nature or textiles or tapestries to find a color palette. My staff did a really great job at setting exterior colors with one of our projects by pulling from beautiful ocean beach pictures. This was for a beach community. And she really developed 3 beautiful color palettes based on just having this beautiful inspirational kind of coastal picture and then pulled the colors from that. And it was a really great way to develop a color palette for a project or an informational board. So yeah, so following these colors in nature sometimes can keep things from being too jarring. Here's natural colors. No clashing hues in nature generally, and varying the shades. So you can, pick an orange, but maybe stay with that same orange and then have it be the same hue, but slightly more white or slightly more gray, tends to keep everything kind of looking cohesive. And here's some examples of informational displays. So you can see this is a plan view for a big resort complex. Nice map taking up the majority of it. This is what we call a brown line print. So back in the day when you had blueprints, they also did brown prints with a sepia. And so it's a really nice earthy way to kind of render or color a project. And then you would lay the color on top of that sepia print, and you have this very kind of naturalistic effect. You can see the major callouts for the features around the project. Again, more intense informational display. So again, this is an example of a National Geographic map. Some other informational displays. This looks like a visitor center. This is a facility, urgent care prototype clinic. So, very architectural elevations, and you've got your plan view, and it conveys the project quite nicely, but you can see those grids and arrangements and alignments throughout that. They've got this naturalistic color scheme, so I think a very nice layout. This is kind of an interesting one to me. It's the Centennial Mall, and you can see as you progress down each block, there's kind of a different feeling and a change of colors throughout it. So I like the way they've got this long linear progression, and then at each area as the theme changes a little bit, you've got these thematic imageries that give you the flavor for that, or even the perspective drawing. So I think a real nice layout there. And this was actually an award-winning ASLA design years ago for communication. So you can kind of see this plan view, and they've kind of followed this stream down and added a perspective in here. There's a lot of information about the problem statement and the overview, but I think it's an interesting graphic layout of this project. And then, sometimes we're having to do reports. So here's an example of multiple pages of a report. That may be the way that you choose to do this assignment is in PowerPoint and have each overlay be its own slide. I'm going to leave that up to you. And that is it. So thank you.